You won't believe what just happened. That's exactly how my day started. Except this time, it wasn't exciting news. It was terrifying. As I sipped my morning coffee, expecting a normal, quiet day, I opened my mailbox and found a crisp, official-looking envelope with the name of my homeowners association stamped on it. At first, I thought it was a routine notice, maybe a reminder about trash pickup or landscaping rules. But the moment I saw the amount written on the first page, my heart practically stopped. $150,000. Yes, you read that right. $150,000. For violations on my property. I blinked, thinking it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a misprint. Maybe someone else's fine accidentally landed in my mailbox. But no, every line, every paragraph confirmed it. The HOA was demanding that I pay this massive sum immediately or face legal action, liens, and potential foreclosure. I sat down, trembling, as I reread the letter. My hands shook, my coffee went cold, and my mind raced. Violations? What violations? I had lived here for years, following every rule, paying every bill, mowing the lawn, keeping my property clean and well-maintained. I even remembered talking to the HOA last year to double-check if my fence and garden decorations were compliant. Everything was fine. Everything. But now, here it was in black and white. The letter cited structural noncompliance, unauthorized modifications, and failure to maintain property standards. The language was formal, intimidating, and loaded with legal jargon. It wasn't written to inform. It was written to scare. Threats of liens, court action, and hefty fines were thrown around like confetti at a parade. Every sentence seemed designed to make me feel powerless. I reread the letter again, hoping something would jump out at me, maybe a date or a typo that I could use. But no, it was precise, detailed, and, frankly, terrifying. It felt like my entire life savings and the roof over my head were at stake. I could almost hear the faint echo of the HOA's collective smirk as I imagined them sending this letter, thinking I'd panic and pay up without question. Panic turned into confusion. Confusion turned into frustration. I called my neighbor just to vent. She laughed nervously, saying, "Wow, that's extreme. Are you sure it's not a scam?" I wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they had confused my address with someone else's. But deep down, I knew that the HOA rarely made mistakes. At least, not the kind that involved this level of money. So, I decided to dig deeper. I pulled out my HOA documents, past emails, and even photographs of my property from previous inspections. Nothing, I repeated to myself. Nothing could possibly justify $150,000 in fines. My property was immaculate. My lawn was perfectly trimmed, my fences were painted, and my small garden shed was exactly the size and style approved years ago. I had receipts, approvals, and photographs that proved my compliance. And yet, here I was, holding a letter that seemed to accuse me of crimes I didn't even know existed. The fear was real. The letter said they could file liens, report me to credit agencies, and even sue for additional damages. I imagined receiving calls from collection agencies, having my bank account frozen, or worse, my property seized. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that was only beginning. Then, I realized something even more disturbing. The notice wasn't just a threat. It implied negligence on my part, like I had purposefully ignored their rules. It suggested that the integrity of the entire neighborhood was at risk because of me. Me, one homeowner, supposedly jeopardizing an entire community. I laughed bitterly at the absurdity, but the laughter quickly turned into anger. How could they accuse me of something so outrageous when I had done everything right? The fear and confusion soon morphed into determination. I couldn't just sit there and accept this fine. I had to understand what was going on. I needed answers. Who authorized this? Who signed off on this letter? And most importantly, how could this happen without my knowledge? I decided to call the HOA office, trying to keep my voice calm while explaining my situation. The receptionist was polite but robotic. She told me to speak with the compliance officer. The compliance officer, in turn, was brusque, almost hostile. "Sir, you are in violation. The fine is non-negotiable. Pay it, or we escalate the matter to collections and court. I asked her to clarify the violations, to provide dates, approvals, or evidence, but all I received was a repeating cycle of legal jargon. It was like talking to a brick wall. By now, the sun had moved across the sky, and I was pacing my living room, letter in hand, thinking, there has to be a mistake. There has to be. The more I read the letter, the more I realized that this was bigger than just a miscommunication. Something about the wording, the references to land parcels, and the mention of neighborhood compliance seemed oddly specific. Too specific. I made a decision. I would not panic. I would not pay a single cent until I understood the full story. I would gather every record, every document, every proof of ownership I had. I would hire a lawyer if I had to, and I would get to the bottom of this bizarre, terrifying, completely surreal find. Little did I know this was just the beginning. What started as a terrifying letter and a $150,000 fine would soon turn my entire understanding of property ownership upside down. By the end of it, I wouldn't just be a homeowner fighting a fine. I would discover a secret so shocking it would change my life forever. Naturally, the first thing I had to do was investigate. I couldn't just sit there and pay a $150,000 fine for something I didn't even know I had done wrong. That would have been absurd. My curiosity and my sense of justice demanded that I figure out exactly what violations I had supposedly committed. So I rolled up my sleeves, cleared my desk, and prepared for what I thought would be a long, tedious day of paperwork. I started by going through every document I could find related to my property. HOA rules, past meeting minutes, notices, amendments to bylaws, and any correspondence that mentioned my address or my property. At first glance, it all seemed normal. Things like landscaping rules, fence heights, paint colors, and restrictions on certain types of exterior decorations. Nothing outrageous, nothing that I hadn't already followed. Hours passed as I meticulously scanned each page, highlighting key points and noting dates, approvals, and references. The more I read, the more confused I became. According to their records, there were alleged violations dating back years, violations that were either entirely fabricated or applied to something that never existed. For example, one section mentioned unauthorized construction of auxiliary structures. Auxiliary structures? I had no sheds, no decks, no extensions beyond what was approved when I bought the house. Every change I had made to my property, small repairs, a new garden, a painted fence, had been done with proper permits and approvals. I double-checked my property lines next, just to be absolutely certain. Using official land surveys, city zoning maps, and even satellite imagery, I verified that every structure on my land was exactly where it was supposed to be. The house itself? Perfectly in compliance. The lawn? Meticulously maintained. Every tree, every flower bed, every tiny decoration I had added over the years? Legal, permitted, and fully within the HOA's own guidelines. Something didn't make sense. I felt like I was missing a piece of a puzzle, but no matter how I shuffled the pieces, nothing fit. It was like trying to solve a crime without knowing the crime had even occurred. Every violation listed in the fine seemed to exist in a vacuum, with no actual evidence, no inspection reports, no photographs, and no dates that matched anything I had done. After hours of digging through the paperwork, I decided to make a call to the HOA office. Maybe speaking to someone directly would clarify things. Maybe there had been a clerical error, a mix-up in addresses, or even an honest mistake. Surely, a reasonable human being on the other end would be able to help me. I dialed the number, took a deep breath, and explained the situation. At first, the receptionist was polite enough, listening as I detailed the notice I had received. But after a few minutes, she handed me off to the compliance officer. That's when things took a turn. The compliance officer was brusque and almost cold. There was no warmth in her voice, no hint of empathy for someone receiving a life-altering fine. "Sir," she said, "the fine is standard procedure. You are in violation of HOA rules. You just need to pay it, or we escalate this matter." Escalate. I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. Escalate to where? What evidence do you have of these violations? Can you show me exactly what I've done wrong? Her response was a repetition of the same corporate line I had already read in the letter. Sir, the fine is non-negotiable. All documentation has been filed. Payment is expected immediately. If you do not comply, further actions will be taken. I pressed harder. I asked her to provide dates, photos, inspection reports, and approvals, or any record of communication prior to this fine. She hesitated, then said, almost with a sigh, Sir, that information is available in our archives. You can request it formally, but the fine still stands in the meantime. In other words, they were asking me to pay first, prove my innocence later. I hung up the phone, my mind spinning. The arrogance, the smugness, it was infuriating. Here I was, a homeowner following every rule, being threatened with $150,000 in fines, and the people enforcing them were coldly insisting I was wrong, without giving me a shred of proof. I realized I couldn't rely on their cooperation. If I wanted to fight this, I would need my own proof. I needed facts, evidence, and historical records that could withstand any challenge. I would need to dig into deeds, surveys, city records, and historical ownership documents, everything that could show the absolute truth of my property and its compliance with local laws. So I began to gather every possible record I could think of, deeds from the county office, past property surveys, architectural approvals, any communication I had with the HOA in the past decade. I even started reviewing the HOA's own filings with the city, trying to trace every rule, bylaw, and claim violation. As I pieced things together, an unsettling thought kept creeping in. What if this wasn't just about minor violations? What if the HOA had made a fundamental mistake about my property? Or worse, what if there was something I didn't know about the land itself? The more I researched, the more I realized that this fine was bigger, stranger, and potentially far more serious than I had ever imagined. By the end of the day, I was exhausted but resolute. I had spent hours in front of documents, maps, and digital records, but I wasn't ready to give up. I understood one thing clearly. If I didn't find the truth, I could be forced to pay an absurd fine for something that didn't even exist. And that was unacceptable. Little did I know, the investigation I had just begun would uncover a shocking secret. Something that would completely overturn my understanding of the situation, the HOA, and even the land I thought I knew. What started as a search for clarity would soon turn into a revelation so unbelievable that it would leave me, and eventually the HOA, speechless. After days of exhausting research, phone calls, and frustrating dead ends, I realized this was bigger than I had imagined. The HOA was relentless. The threats were mounting, and the $150,000 fine still hung over my head like a storm cloud. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I needed an expert, a professional who could navigate the maze of land records, property deeds, and legal loopholes. That's when I decided to hire a property lawyer. The moment we met, I could tell she was someone who didn't back down. Her eyes scanned the documents I brought like a hawk, and her pen moved furiously, marking notes on every line. Let's see what we're really dealing with, she said. There was no dramatics, no shaking of heads, just focus, precision, and determination. Together, we started combing through decades of historical land records. At first, everything seemed routine. Deeds, past owners, easements, maps of the neighborhood, and old city permits lined the table. I watched as my lawyer traced every line, every boundary, every property number. She paused occasionally, frowning at some discrepancies. Then she'd flip a page, mutter under her breath, and start cross-referencing with older documents. Hours turned into days, and I began to notice her tone changing. At first, it was curiosity, then confusion, and finally disbelief. I leaned over the table, trying to catch her expression. What is it? I asked, heart thumping. She looked up, eyes wide, almost unsteady. Do you realize what this means? She asked. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she tapped on the deed. You don't just own this property. You own all of it. At first, I didn't understand. What do you mean, all of it? I asked, trying to mask the nervous laughter creeping into my voice. She spread out the maps and pointed to each lot. Every single lot in this neighborhood. Every house. Every street. Every shared area. even the little park that the HOA manages. It's all legally registered under your name. I froze. My brain refused to process it at first. Slowly, it began to sink in. Every fine, every threat, every late notice, every inspection, they had been targeting me, the actual owner, without realizing it. The $150,000 fine wasn't just wrong. It was absurd. I wasn't the tenant. I wasn't the renter. I wasn't even just a homeowner. I was the boss of this entire neighborhood. I sat back in my chair, stunned. My mind replayed the events of the past week, the month, even the past few years. Every time the HOA had sent notices, held meetings, or issued warnings, they had been unknowingly trying to enforce rules on their own landlord. I laughed, and then I cried, and then I laughed again. It was a cocktail of emotions so intense that I could barely breathe. Images flashed in my mind. The board members, the office staff, the stern notices, the fines. They had been so smug, so confident in their authority. All that power, all that control, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. The thought was almost cinematic. I could see it unfolding like a movie in my mind, me quietly smiling as they unknowingly toiled under my authority. I asked my lawyer to explain again, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Legally, you have full ownership rights, she said, pointing to the original deeds, some dating back decades. Any action the HOA takes against these properties without your consent is essentially void. They've been enforcing rules on their landlord. And in fact, you have the legal leverage to reverse every single fine and claim. The enormity of it hit me. I wasn't just dealing with a simple misunderstanding or a bureaucratic error. I was holding the ultimate power over the HOA. They had been trying to find me, control me, and assert authority, and all along, I had been the one with the legal upper hand. I leaned back, letting it all sink in. Every late fee, every inspection notice, every angry letter, they had been irrelevant, meaningless, powerless. I could have challenged each one, demanded apologies, or even renegotiated the rules. The realization was intoxicating. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control, confident, almost untouchable. And then, the more practical side of me kicked in. I began imagining what this meant going forward. I could finally set the rules straight. I could decide how the neighborhood was managed. I could cancel the fines. I could take back control from a board that had been overstepping its authority, enforcing arbitrary rules, and mismanaging my own property. The possibilities were endless and delicious. But amid the excitement, there was also a strange sense of responsibility. Owning an entire neighborhood was not just a legal twist. It was a reality that came with decisions, consequences, and obligations. The little park where children played, the streets lined with homes, the shared spaces and amenities, they all fell under my ownership. I realized that this was not just a funny story about an HOA overstepping boundaries. This was a lesson about knowing your rights, understanding property, and standing up for yourself. I spent the next few hours reviewing every detail, confirming each deed, and mapping out the neighborhood. Every property line, every house, every road, all led back to me. I could almost feel the weight of it, the power and the responsibility intertwined in a way I had never experienced before. And all of it started with that terrifying $150,000 fine, a fine that had seemed impossible, unfair, and insurmountable. By the end of the day, I had processed the full impact of the discovery. I laughed until my sides hurt, cried until I couldn't see straight, and marveled at the absurdity of it all. The HOA, with all their rules, fines, and threats, had unknowingly been enforcing policies on their own boss. I, the unassuming homeowner, had become the silent ruler of the entire neighborhood. And in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. Sometimes reality throws a twist so wild, so unexpected, that it leaves you stunned, laughing, and completely empowered, all at the same time. Armed with the shocking discovery and irrefutable proof that I own every single lot in the neighborhood, I finally felt a surge of confidence I hadn't experienced in weeks. For the first time, I was not the victim of the HOA's relentless bureaucracy. I was the one holding all the cards. Every threat, every fine, every lien they had ever sent my way suddenly felt powerless, irrelevant, and almost laughable. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA board, determined to confront them face to face. Normally, I would have dreaded such an encounter, heart racing, palms sweaty, and tongue-tied. But this time was different. This time, I knew the truth. This time, I had the ultimate leverage. I arrived at their office carrying a thick folder of documents. Deeds, official records, maps, historical documents dating back decades, all proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I own the entire neighborhood. My lawyer accompanied me, not only for support, but to ensure that everything was presented accurately and legally. As I walked in, I could feel the subtle shift in the air. The confidence I exuded was palpable. The board members greeted me with their usual smug expressions, expecting to intimidate me, expecting to assert authority. One by one, I could see them glance at each other, whispering quietly. They probably assumed this would be another round of me pleading, negotiating, or panicking. They were wronged. I calmly set the folder on the table and opened it to the first page. These are the official deeds for every property in this neighborhood, I said, my voice steady and confident. Every lot, every street, every home, and even the community park is legally owned by me. There was a brief silence. I could see the confusion creeping onto their faces. Eyebrows raised, mouth slightly open. Some looked like they were trying to remember if they had skipped a meeting. Others were just frozen, completely unprepared for this revelation. It was almost comical, like watching a group of actors forgetting their lines mid-performance. I continued, flipping through the documents one by one. These historical records go back decades. The original land deeds, the transfer of ownership, every survey ever conducted, all confirm that I am the lawful owner of this entire neighborhood. I paused for effect, letting the words sink in. In short, every fine you've ever sent me, every threat you've ever made, was targeting the person who legally owns your entire jurisdiction. The reactions were priceless. One board member, usually the most outspoken and arrogant, suddenly lost his confident posture. He fidgeted with his pen, looking down at the table, trying to regain composure. Another whispered something to a colleague, whose eyes widened in shock. I could see panic starting to bubble just beneath their calm exteriors. Finally, I leaned forward slightly and added, I want to be very clear. The rules you've been enforcing, the fines you've been issuing, they cannot stand on my property without my consent. Moving forward, I suggest we proceed with a more respectful approach. The room was tense, the kind of silence that feels heavy and almost suffocating. For the first time, I was in control. The power dynamic had completely flipped. I wasn't pleading or negotiating. I wasn't scared. I was the authority, the one who could dictate terms, the one who could decide what happened next. Then came the moment of decision. I could have gone further, demand apologies, compensation for stress, or even restructuring the HOA board entirely. But I decided to take a measured approach. I wanted them to understand the gravity of the situation without pushing them into complete panic. I calmly closed the folder and said, the fines are canceled. Consider this matter resolved. But let this be a lesson. The property you manage does not belong to you. It belongs to me, and any future enforcement must respect that fact. I could see their shoulders slumped slightly. Relief mixed with disbelief painted their faces. They were realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the world they thought they controlled was not under their authority at all, and it had taken me, a seemingly ordinary homeowner, to reveal that truth. I added one last thing, almost as a reminder. I trust that going forward, all HOA actions will be conducted with proper awareness of property ownership and legal authority. Missteps like this are not acceptable and can have serious consequences. The words hung in the air like a warning, yet delivered with calm authority. After that, I turned to my lawyer, who nodded approvingly, and we left the room. I could almost hear their collective sighs behind me, a mixture of relief that the confrontation was over and realization that their power had been overestimated. For me, the walk out of that building felt triumphant. I had faced one of the most intimidating forces in my community, and I had turned the tables completely. Over the next few days, the neighborhood dynamics subtly shifted. Notices from the HOA became fewer, more measured, and markedly less threatening. Board members were suddenly more polite when I crossed paths with them. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was the person who legally owned the entire community they governed. Reflecting back, I realized how important it had been to know my rights, verify ownership, and stand firm. The entire ordeal could have been a nightmare, an unfair fine, endless legal wrangling, and weeks of stress. But by taking the time to gather proof, understanding my legal standing, and confronting the situation with confidence, I had not only nullified the fines, but also reclaimed authority. It was empowering, to say the least. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about bureaucracy, authority, and self-advocacy. Sometimes people or institutions wield power arrogantly, assuming compliance and submission. And sometimes all it takes is knowledge, preparation, and courage to remind them who's really in charge. That day, I didn't just win against the HOA. I had transformed the narrative entirely. I was no longer reacting to their rules or threats. I was proactively guiding how the neighborhood would be managed, simply because I understood my legal rights and had the courage to assert them. The entire dynamic had shifted, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that justice, unexpected, ironic, and completely satisfying, had been served. After the dust settled, the HOA scrambled to regroup. Board meetings were held behind closed doors. Emails circulated frantically, and I could almost hear the whispers as they tried to figure out how to regain some semblance of control. But it was too late. The tables had been turned, and legally, I was untouchable. The neighborhood, which had always felt like a rigid maze of rules, fines, and petty disputes, suddenly looked very different through my eyes. For years, I had thought of the HOA as this all-powerful authority, the ultimate decision-maker over everything that happened on our streets. I had worried about rules I didn't understand, fines that seemed arbitrary, and inspectors who appeared to have the power to ruin my day, or worse, my finances. But now I saw things clearly. Knowledge was power, and in this case, it had made all the difference. Those who had strutted around with authority, making declarations and passing judgment, weren't truly in control. I was. Walking through the neighborhood for the first time after the showdown, I felt a strange mix of pride and amusement. I looked at the little park where children played, the houses lining the streets, and the familiar sidewalks, and I realized that it all belonged to me, not in some vague, abstract sense, but legally, verifiably, and undeniably. Every patch of grass, every driveway, every mailbox was under my ownership. The power I had gained was subtle but profound. The authority didn't need to be wielded through fines or threats. Simply knowing the truth had shifted the dynamic completely. As I strolled past neighbors chatting in their yards, I couldn't help but smile. They had no idea. To them, I was still just a friendly face, another homeowner among many. But I carried a secret that was both empowering and hilarious. Every HOA notice that had once sent shivers down my spine now seemed almost comical in hindsight. I imagined the faces of the board members as I confronted them. Shock, confusion, panic, a bit of disbelief. And I chuckled quietly to myself. It was a mixture of justice and irony that I relished. The people who had believed they were in control had, in fact, been operating on the land of the person they were trying to control. Every rule, every regulation, every petty complaint had been directed at the actual owner. That realization alone was satisfying, and it brought a sense of triumph that words can hardly capture. Over the next few days, the HOA attempted to reassert authority. I received a flurry of emails, some polite, some vaguely threatening, and a few that seemed almost desperate. But this time I was calm. I responded professionally, firmly, and with all the documentation to back up my position. The fines were permanently canceled. All pending claims were voided, and the board learned, perhaps for the first time, that rules only hold weight when applied correctly and fairly. What surprised me most was how quickly the neighborhood's atmosphere changed once the HOA realized the reality of ownership. Meetings became more cooperative rather than combative. Notices were sent with transparency and clarity. People seemed more willing to engage respectfully, now that they understood that authority without accountability was meaningless. I hadn't just defended my property. I had subtly reshaped the way the entire community functioned. As I continued walking through the streets, I reflected on the deeper lessons this experience had taught me. First and foremost, always know your deeds and your legal rights. Never assume that authority is absolute simply because someone claims it. Bureaucracy, fines, and rules may appear intimidating, but they hold power only if you allow them to. Knowledge and preparation are your greatest allies in situations like these. Second, I realize the importance of patience and strategy. I didn't storm into the HOA demanding immediate action or revenge. I methodically gathered evidence, consulted experts, and approached the confrontation with calm authority. The power of preparedness cannot be overstated. It turned what could have been a stressful nightmare into a decisive victory. Third, there's a lesson in humility for the so-called authorities. People often assume control through intimidation, assuming others will comply out of fear or ignorance. But true power lies in legitimacy and fairness, not threats or dominance. Once the HOA saw that I had the legal right on my side, their supposed control dissolved like mist. And finally, there's a lesson in perspective. Walking through the streets, I realized that life has a way of teaching lessons in unexpected ways. The fear and anxiety I initially felt were genuine, intense, and almost paralyzing. But facing them, uncovering the truth, and asserting my rights turned that fear into a story I could laugh about, a story I could share, and a story that reaffirmed the value of self-advocacy. I also noticed a personal transformation. I had grown more confident, more assertive, and more aware of my own agency. For years, I had felt like a small player in a larger system of rules and authority. But now, I understood that with knowledge, courage, and patience, even the most intimidating systems can be challenged, and sometimes completely overturned. Even as neighbors went about their daily lives, oblivious of the legal reality of the land beneath their feet, I smiled. They may never know the full story, but I knew the truth. And that truth was beautiful. A mix of justice, empowerment, irony, and laughter. Every letter, every fine, every tense moment in the office now seemed almost like part of a comedic script I had starred in and won. So, as I reflect on this entire experience, I want to leave you with a few words of wisdom, especially for fellow homeowners, renters, or anyone navigating bureaucracy. Always check your deeds, know your rights, and never underestimate the power of your own land. What seems like a threat or an insurmountable obstacle may, with careful attention and courage, turn into an opportunity to assert authority, claim justice, and even reshape your surroundings. In the end, the story isn't just about fines or property. It's about the unexpected ways life can teach lessons, reveal truths, and empower individuals who are willing to dig, fight, and stand firm. The HOA's arrogance, my initial fear, and the final triumph are all reminders that sometimes the world works in the most unexpected, ironic, and satisfying ways. And sometimes the quietest homeowner holds the loudest power of all. As I continue my walks through the neighborhood, I carry that lesson with me every day. I smile, I laugh, and I marvel at the irony of it all. The streets, the homes, the little park, they're mine. And while the homeowners may never know the full story, I do. And that knowledge, that empowerment, is priceless.